Tonight on Global Perspectives, it's a billion-ton problem. Currently, it is estimated that cities around the world produce about 1.3 billion tons of solid waste every year, and all that garbage is costing about $205 billion globally. In less than 15 years, the amount of solid waste that people in urban areas generate is expected to increase by more than 1 billion tons. And local governments across the world are struggling to find solutions to deal with this ever-increasing amount of garbage that we produce, because it has an impact on various other sectors. For example, on climate change. Solid waste produces a significant amount of methane, a greenhouse gas that is about 21 times more powerful than carbon dioxide at warming the atmosphere. Then there is public health. Uncollected solid waste contributes to the spread of health problems such as diarrhea and dengue fever. Tonight on Global Perspectives, we're taking a closer look at waste management. How big of a problem is it? What does the process involve? And how can ordinary citizens help? Our guest this week is Francoise Jacob from the United Nations Office for Project Services.
Know that in Sri Lanka right now there is about 6,000 tons of waste generated all around the island, different waste. And out of the 6,000 tons, 25% only is collected.
Ms. Jacob will also talk in depth about various aspects of the waste management process and the situation here in Sri Lanka. According to her, when it comes to waste management, Sri Lanka and in particular Colombo seems to be getting it right. That's what's ahead on Global Perspectives tonight.
Good evening and welcome to the show. Last Wednesday, organizations around the world celebrated United Nations Day. And here at Global Perspectives, we thought we'd mark the event by focusing on a problem that is often underreported, at least here in Sri Lanka. On today's show, we're going to talk about garbage and waste management, particularly solid waste that comes from our own homes. Before we go on to discussing some of the specifics about the waste management process, let's first take a quick look at the magnitude of the problem around the world. Here's Madhushka Balasuriya with this report.
In any country, the waste problem is primarily an urban problem. 10 years ago, the global urban population was about 2.9 billion. And those residents were producing about 700 million tons of waste every year. According to World Bank estimates, while the number of people living in cities increased by about 100 million in the past decade, the amount of waste they generate has increased by about 600 million tons. The amount of waste urban populations produce is far greater than the rate of urbanization, and local governing authorities around the world are just not adequately prepared to handle the demand. Let's take a look at some of the waste problems countries around the world are facing today, starting with our closest neighbor. With the second largest population in the world, India's waste problems are nothing new. The country's latest waste dilemma is coming from the Bangalore region. Farmers in the village of Mandur in the outskirts of Bangalore have been blocking garbage trucks from dumping trash at the local landfill. They are demanding the authorities to first process the garbage that is already there before dumping new garbage. They say the situation at the landfill is creating health risks for the community. Without the availability of the Mandur landfill, it is estimated that 2,000 tons of waste accumulate on the streets of Bangalore each day. The volcanic island off the coast of Taiwan, known as the ORCHID Island, is also facing a serious garbage crisis. In addition to the many concerns brought on by the nuclear waste storage facility that was established in the 80s, now the scenic island is facing a severe pollution problem. Experts are saying effective recycling will be the only answer, but that there needs to be much greater public awareness. Jamaica has also been struggling with a garbage problem, particularly with waste collection. The problem is in Kingston, where the local authority collects and transports about 53 tons of trash every month, more than any other part of the island. However, recent news reports from the country indicate that there aren't enough garbage trucks for collection. The Jamaica Observer newspaper reports that only 11 of the city's 62 trucks are operational. And these aren't the only cities facing waste management problems. Urban centers in high, middle and low-income countries are forced to grapple with various kinds of garbage issues. However, with the highest regional population, Asia continues to have the fastest growth in waste. I'm Mangesh Balasuriya from the News First International Desk.
Tonight we're speaking with Françoise Jacob, the Director and Representative of the United Nations Office for Project Services, or UNOPS. Ms. Jacob has more than 15 years of experience in international development and humanitarian aid and has worked in countries such as Afghanistan and Sudan. But she is also no stranger to Sri Lanka, having worked here before as well. In this first segment, Ms. Jacob talks about the extent of the waste management problem around the world. And even though there's a lot of room for improvement here in Sri Lanka as well, according to Ms. Jacob, Sri Lanka happens to be doing a lot of things right. As you know, we're talking about waste management on this particular episode, and you probably know already, having been in Sri Lanka and working here, it's not a topic we hear about too much, particularly in the media, in general conversation. We generally don't talk about it much, so perhaps we don't really, that's why we don't know too much about it. I was wondering, to start off with, before we get down to some of the details, could you tell us from your perspective why this is such a big problem and why our attention should be?
Usually people don't want to hear about waste. They don't want to talk about waste, and mostly they don't want to see waste. All right. So to give you a very simple picture, 50 years ago there were 2 billion people on the planet. Now there is about 7 billion. With the exponential increase of the population, you have a completely huge increase of waste generation. Now, I say waste, other people will say garbage, to make it very simple. Right. Okay? So with the increased population, increased generation of waste, all sorts of waste, and also a more complex generation of waste. So we used to only work or generate food waste. Now you have all sorts of industrial waste, waste coming out of the hotel businesses, waste coming out of any commercial businesses, coming out of schools, out of the hospitals. So it's becoming a big issue. I like to compare it a little bit to climate change. It's becoming big, it's global, and it's urgent. So now, how does it affect us in our daily life? Well, if we manage waste improperly, we have three main issues, basically. One is the public health. And if I relate to Sri Lanka, as you very well know, dengue, for example, is an issue here in some of the urban areas. Well, improper waste management and waste lying around will contribute to increase dengue, because you have these small water pools which mosquitoes are using for breathing and then spread the disease. Poor waste management also means that water may be soiled, the ground for cultivations may be damaged. And then finally, in terms of missed economic opportunities, as you can very well imagine, when you have dirty beaches, whether on the East Coast or on the South Coast, well, it's not good for the tourist business. And this country has some very big ambition for developing tourism. So waste is definitely an issue to solve from very, very different aspects.
You mentioned now our waste is increasing, as population increases, and you mentioned the different types. Can you describe a little bit more? Different sectors consider different things as waste. If you talk about the climate scientists, they'll consider some things as waste. The economic sector, a different part. Can you give us some ideas of what actually constitutes waste when you're talking about waste management?
Yes. Well, first you should know that in Sri Lanka right now there is about 6,000 tons of waste generated all around the island, different ways. And out of the 6,000 tons, 25% only is collected. So
where did the rest go?
That's it. Where does the rest go? It doesn't go anywhere. It just goes in your backyard. It goes in public area. It goes on illegal dump sites. And that's where you have the pollution that starts to trickle throughout your neighborhood. So there are different ways. Households, so typically you and me, we produce mostly what is called wet waste, biodegradable waste. That's from food production, food consumed. Then we also produce plastic from the bottles, glass, etc. That's quite minor. Then you will have the restaurants or the hospitality business. They will produce, again, this sort of wet biodegradable waste, but they're also going to produce a lot of wastewater. So that goes into the sewage system, or it doesn't go into the sewage system if there is improper system. Then you have the industries. That's where it starts to become much more dangerous. Various industries, various manufacturers will produce poisonous, what is called dangerous industrial waste. So that's all sorts of leakage from the garment industry, from the food production industry, from any type of industry.
You talk about our common practices, you know, household practices of just dumping the waste anywhere where it's not too collected in a proper way. Something that's talked about in waste management is source reduction, like actually reducing the waste you produce rather than thinking about where to throw it away later on.
Yeah.
But we're not accustomed to thinking like that here in Sri Lanka. Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of practices have proved successful in other countries?
Sure. Well, first, let me tell you, this is not just in Sri Lanka, okay? I'm from France, and in my country, it's also very difficult for people to reduce waste, because you can't just reduce waste on your own. Of course, one element is to consume less, but that's not quite, we are not quite there yet.
Right.
But one way to reduce waste is, of course, to reduce all the packaging. So you go to a shop and you buy something, and it's wrapped into a plastic, and then it's packaged into a cardboard, and then you put it in another plastic bag, and then you put it in whatever, another. So this in itself generates a huge amount of waste, which is completely unnecessary, right? So there is actually, in a number of countries, there is a strong incentive for a certain industry to try and reduce the packaging. Then, of course, one way to reduce waste is to reuse items. So there are some items that you can, bottles of water, glass bottles, you can reuse for either for the same function or for different functions. Then there is, of course, the recycling part. But what is very important next to reducing is actually the segregation of waste. And segregation means you have different waste, and you are going to separate different waste so that when they get collected, they can go in different paths where they are treated differently. And the ultimate objective is to reduce that final bit of garbage which is going to go into a landfill. Because today, one of the main problem is the lack of land, right? The land is very valuable, and the population is growing. So we don't have space to store the waste. And so these spaces are getting further and further from the urban area, so from the places where the waste is generated, which means you need a lot of logistics to transport that waste. It costs a lot of money, and it produces a lot of pollution in itself, just the transport of that waste. So the idea is to say, okay, let's see what we produce in the house, what we generate in terms of waste. We are going to put it in 3 or 4 different kind of bags, and then these bags, the plastic will go into a certain truck, and then the glass will go into another truck, and then the biodegradable will go in another place, and then maybe 10%. I think in Sweden there is something like 10% of the waste that actually goes to a landfill. And even with that 10%, you can do something, and that's generating power.